The Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 8 is finally here, and compared with the Galaxy Z Fold 7, this is a much bigger change than the name might suggest. Samsung has moved away from the tall, narrow cover display and the more productivity-focused shape of the previous folds. Instead, the regular Fold 8 is designed around the things most people actually do with their phones every day: watching videos, browsing social media, texting, gaming, checking maps, and just using the phone normally. The productivity-first approach hasn't disappeared completely. Samsung has essentially moved that idea into the more expensive Galaxy Z Fold 8 Ultra, and honestly, I think Samsung may have made the right call. After using the Galaxy Z Fold 8 for a week, the new wider and shorter design has genuinely changed the way I look at book-style foldables. It feels much more approachable, it's easier to handle with one hand, apps feel more natural on the outer display, and there is something about the overall design that makes you want to keep using it. Despite carrying the familiar phone's name, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 doesn't really feel like the Fold phones we have become accustomed to over the last few years, and that's intentional. This is Samsung's first major redesign of its book-style foldable formula. Instead of sticking with the tall outer display and boxier internal screen, Samsung has gone for a much wider and shorter approach that feels noticeably different in the hand. On the outside, you get a 5.5-inch 16:10 display. It's shorter, wider, and has almost a passport-like shape. Open the fold up, and you get a larger 7.8-inch display with a 3:4 aspect ratio that looks much closer to a traditional tablet. The first time I picked up the Fold 8, I immediately understood what Samsung was trying to do, and after using it for a week, that initial impression hasn't really changed. I have spent a lot of time with book-style foldables, including the Galaxy Z Fold 7 and the Oppo Find N6, and after using the Fold 8, it's honestly difficult to go back to the old boxier approach. The biggest benefit is the outer display. That shorter and wider cover screen is simply easier to use with one hand. You still get a proper smartphone experience, but the screen doesn't feel as awkward or cramped as some previous Samsung Fold displays. Apps like TikTok and YouTube look good, games work nicely, messaging feels more natural, and because the display is wider, you have more horizontal space available than you did with the Samsung's older Fold cover screens. Then, whenever you need more screen real estate, you just unfold the phone and suddenly you have a 7.8-inch tablet-style display. The overall experience feels like Samsung has taken the versatility of a book-style foldable and mixed it with some of the compactness and convenience of a flip phone, and surprisingly, that combination works really well. The weight also deserves a lot of attention. At only 201 grams, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 is extremely light for a book-style foldable. In fact, it's lighter than Samsung's own Galaxy S26 Ultra, which is pretty crazy when you consider that this phone opens up into a much larger display. And because Samsung is pushing this phone toward movies, social media, gaming, and general everyday use, that lower weight actually matters. You are going to be holding this thing for a long periods, and the difference becomes noticeably pretty quickly. The smaller overall footprint also means it fits into a pocket much more comfortably than previous Fold models. It doesn't have that long, tall shape, and it doesn't have the same sense of bulk when you carry it around. The hinge is slightly different from what you get on the Fold 8 Ultra. It isn't quite as flexible, so getting the phone to stay open halfway in a laptop-style position takes a little more effort. But there is a benefit to that. The display opens much more easily with one hand, and the phone almost pops up open without triggering much more force. Samsung says that was intentional because the company expects this version to be used differently from the Ultra. You can still position it halfway open, you can use the outer display in a tent style setup or prop the inner display into a laptop style position if you really want to, but with the 3:4 inner screen, I don't think laptop mode is going to be a major use case for most people. And if that is what you care about the most, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 Ultra is probably the better fit. Samsung also gives you several nice color options this year: graphite, cream, lavender and pistachio. The pistachio model is a Samsung store exclusive, which is a little disappointing because it's easily my favorite of the other colors. The lavender version I tasted is still very nice too. As for durability, the story is mostly unchanged. The Fold 8 is IP48 rated, which means it has water resistance and can survive being submerged up to around 1.5 meters for as long as 30 minutes. However, Samsung hasn't really improved protection against smaller dust particles. Anything below 1 millimeter can still potentially get into the phone and cause problems. At this point, Google is still basically the company that has pushed farthest toward full dust and water resistance on foldables. So while the Fold 8 isn't leading the industry here, it also isn't exactly an exception. Samsung's cover displays have often feel like secondary screen compared with the main folding panel. With the Galaxy Z Fold 8 though, I don't think that's the case anymore. The 5.5-inch outer display is genuinely useful. The 16:10 ratio gives you a much wider screen without making the phone awkwardly tall. That makes everyday tasks like responding to messages, browsing apps, scrolling through social media and navigating with Google Maps feel much more natural. You get more room for images on social platforms, messages are easier to read and you don't constantly feel like you need to unfold the phone just to do something basic. It's also a surprisingly good screen for gaming and for watching standard 16:9 content on Netflix. You will still see some blackbars above and below the video, but they are relatively small. What impressed me most is that the display doesn't really feel small despite only being 5.5 inches. That has historically been one of the biggest issues with fold cover screens, especially Samsung's. They often worked, but they also feel compromised. This one doesn't. The display itself also matches the quality level you'd expect from a flagship Samsung phone, and that helps the outer screen feel like a real smartphone display rather than simply a temporary preview screen. Obviously, the main attraction is still the internal panel, and this 7.8-inch screen is excellent. You are getting dynamic AMOLED 2X, a 120Hz LTPO refresh rate and up to 3000 nits of peak brightness. It's bright, sharp, vibrant and has the kind of contrast and color quality you'd expect from Samsung. But for me, the biggest improvements are the aspect ratio and the crease. The 3:4 shape is a huge change. It sounds like a relatively small adjustment, but it completely changes how the internal screen behaves with apps. Almost every app I used worked naturally in landscape orientation, including WhatsApp, Slack, YouTube, and Instagram. That was a surprisingly freeing experience. With older boxier foldables, there were plenty of situations where I'd open an app and wonder whether it was going to look right on the internal display. Here I just opened the app and used it. No second guessing. The new aspect ratio also works really well for video. Movies tend to fit the display more naturally, so even though you still have blackbars, the actual video occupies more of the screen compared with the more unusual shapes on some foldable, including the Z Fold 8 Ultra. Interestingly, I found myself using the internal display in portrait orientation most of the time. It basically becomes a giant smartphone screen, which is fantastic for scrolling through apps, playing portrait-oriented games, and especially watching vertical video on TikTok. The downside is that the 3:4 layout isn't quite as useful for intensive split-screen multitasking as the Ultra's screen. That said, I still had no problem casually running two apps side by side for messaging, browsing, or basic multitasking. You obviously don't get as much room as you would with the Ultra, but it's still significantly more useful than doing the same thing on a normal phone. So I wouldn't completely dismiss the regular Fold as a productivity device just because Samsung positions the Ultra above it. The other major improvements comes from Samsung's new Flex titanium technology. It uses two layers within the folding display to help reduce the visibility of the crease and make the screen feel more solid when you touch it. And yes, I think it works. The internal display feels more rigid than Samsung's previous foldables. There is a less of that soft, plasticky sensation when you press against it, and the anti-reflective coating borrowed from the 26 Ultra also helps reduce some of the plastic-like reflections you normally see. That is a meaningful improvement on its own. Then you have the crease, or more accurately, the lack of a very obvious one. Looking directly at the phone while it is lying flat, the center crease is surprisingly difficult to see. You can still notice it when viewing from an angle, and you can definitely feel it when you run your finger across the middle, but visually it's much less distracting than before. I still think the Oppo Find N6 has a slight advantage when it comes to minimizing the crease, but compared with what Samsung offered only a year ago, this is a very significant step forward. Under the hood, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 is still using serious flagship hardware. Even though Samsung places it below the Fold 8 Ultra, the regular Z Fold 8 gets the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 for Galaxy, the same high-end chip found in the Galaxy S26 Ultra, that's paired with 12GB of RAM and storage options of 256GB, 512GB or 1TB. On paper, that sounds like a powerhouse, and for most everyday tasks, it absolutely is. Over the past week, the phone has felt fast and responsive. One UI is so smooth, apps launch quickly, scrolling feels fluid, and normal multitasking doesn't really present a problem. But there are some limitations once you start pushing the phone hard. I noticed occasional shuddering while doing demanding tasks, particularly when editing multiple layers of 4K video in CapCut Pad. The phone also doesn't seem especially comfortable running extremely demanding games like Wuthering Waves. With everything turned up to the maximum, it starts getting warm after only a few minutes. So the problem isn't necessarily the chipset itself. The Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 is clearly capable. The issue seems to be that the thinner, smaller body of the regular Fold 8 has less room to deal with sustained heat than the larger Fold 8 Ultra. And that means performance can drop when you keep stressing the device for longer periods. Interestingly, Samsung seems to be aware of this. During my testing, the company had blocked a number of benchmarking apps we typically use, including Geekbench 6 and 3D Mark. That isn't completely unusual for unreleased phones from companies like Xiaomi and Honor, but this was the first time I'd personally seen Samsung do it. The more interesting part is that Fold 8 Ultra does not have those same restrictions. Fortunately, Geekbench 7 launched while I was testing the phone, and it wasn't included on Samsung's block list, so I was able to get some performance numbers, and they pretty much matched with what I experienced in real-world use. Despite having the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 for Galaxy, the regular Fold 8 doesn't quite match the larger Fold 8 Ultra or some other bookstore foldables in sustained CPU and GPU performance. For most people though, that don't matter. The phone still feels fast. Scrolling through One UI is smooth, apps open almost immediately, and normal browsing and multitasking are problem-free. Only when you start using the phone as a serious sustained performance machine do those limitations become more noticeable. So, for power users, this is something to keep in mind. The Galaxy Z Fold 8 alongside the Fold 8 Ultra and Flip 8 is among the first Samsung phones to launch with Android 17. That puts Samsung ahead of Google's upcoming Pixel 11 lineup by a few weeks. Of course, this isn't stock Android. Samsung is running One UI 9, and despite the competition from software skins from Honor, Xiaomi, Oppo and Redmagic, I still think One UI is one of the more polished Android interfaces available. It generally strikes a good balance between simplicity and customization while also adding plenty of useful functionality that becomes especially important on a foldable. You get the foldable taskbar, an app tray, split screen multitasking, floating windows and several other features specifically designed around taking advantage of that bigger internal display. So even though Samsung doesn't position the regular Fold 8 as its main productivity device anymore. The productivity tools are still very much here, but as with recent versions of One UI, artificial intelligence is one of the biggest talking points. You get the familiar Galaxy AI suite, including features that debuted with the Galaxy S26 series, such as Photo Assist. There are also some new additions for content creators. One of the more interesting features is My Fan Cam. It lets you select a specific person or subject in a video you have already recorded and then automatically crop and track that subject, while also allowing you to change things like the aspect ratio. In my testing, the tracking worked surprisingly well. It stayed locked onto the subject smoothly without constantly losing them. Samsung has also added several Gemini-powered features that were previously limited to Pixel devices. That includes more advanced Gemini automation capabilities that allow Gemini to perform certain tasks inside apps on your behalf. Now, Brief has also been improved. It pulls information from more sources, which makes the feature feel more useful than it did before. It works particularly well if you also have a Samsung wearables, since the morning brief can include health insights alongside things like weather, news, YouTube recommendation, Spotify playlists, and weekly recaps of places you have visited and photos you have captured. That extra personalization makes Now Brief feel much less like a generic information feed. You can even create custom Now Brief cards using Gemini. One UI also introduces a few features that are clearly inspired by iOS. That includes AI prioritized notifications, which move more important alerts toward the top of the lock screen, along with notification summaries for messaging apps. The priority system actually worked fairly well for me. The notification summaries too are another story. Considering how much attention Apple's version of that feature has received, Samsung is taking a bit of a risk by implementing something similar. Personally, I don't really use it. Still, it's there if you want it. And like Samsung's other flagship foldables, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 gets 7 years of OS updates and security patches, which should keep the phone relevant for a long time. The new design is one of the strongest reasons to buy the Galaxy Z Fold 8. Unfortunately, the camera setup is one of the areas that makes the phone harder to recommend at its price. Samsung has equipped a regular Z Fold 8 with a dual camera system consisting of a 50 megapixel main sensor and a 50 megapixel ultra-wide. There is no dedicated telephoto camera, and that's a little frustrating because the Z Fold 8 is still an expensive flagship. In fact, it costs comfortably more than phones like the iPhone 17 Pro Max and the Oppo Find X9 Ultra. So the expectations for camera hardware is naturally pretty high. What makes the decision even harder to understand is that the last year's Galaxy Z Fold 7 had a more advanced camera package for roughly the same price. You had a 200 megapixel main camera, an ultra-wide, and a dedicated zoom lens. This year, that more capable triple camera setup has effectively been moved to the much more expensive Z Fold 8 Ultra. So, with the regular Z Fold 8, Samsung is asking you to settle for a simpler camera setup. The main and ultra-wide cameras are capable and can produce good-looking results in plenty of situations, but the lack of a proper zoom lens becomes obvious once you start moving closer to distant subjects. Samsung could have compensated for that by using the Ultra's higher resolution 200 megapixel sensor and relying on in-sensor cropping for better zoom quality. But that isn't what happened. As a result, zoom performance is one of the weaker parts of the camera experience. Here are some camera samples from the Galaxy Z Fold 8. Considering how much smaller and lighter the Galaxy Z Fold 8 is compared with the Fold 8 Ultra, I was actually a little surprised by the battery capacity. Samsung has managed to fit a 4800 mAh battery inside the phone, which is only 200 mAh smaller than the Ultra's 5000 mAh battery. That's a pretty respectable result for such a compact foldable. For most users, the Galaxy Z Fold 8's battery life should be perfectly acceptable. I used the phone pretty heavily during my testing, in large part because I genuinely enjoyed using the new form factor. That meant I was averaging around 6 hours of screen on time every day. Even with that level of use, I was generally able to make it through 16 to 18 hour days and still have some battery left by the time I went to bed. Charging is another area where Samsung is solid rather than class leading. The phone supports 45 watt wire charging, which isn't especially fast compared with some competitors, but because the battery is only 4800 mAh, the phone doesn't take an unreasonable amount of time to recharge. In my testing, a 15-minute charge took the phone to around 35%. After 30 minutes, it reached about 67%, and a full charge took approximately 68 minutes. There is also support for 20 watt wireless charging, which is useful. Unfortunately, Samsung still hasn't built in a MagSafe style magnetic mounting system, unlike the competing Pixel 10 Pro Fold. Given how much Samsung is emphasizing the Fold 8 as a content-focused phone, having an easy magnetic way to mount it for watching videos would have been a nice addition. Maybe next year. The Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 8 feels like a turning point for Samsung's foldable lineup. Instead of continuing to push the regular fold toward an increasingly productivity-heavy design, Samsung has created something that is noticeably lighter, easier to use, and much more natural as an everyday smartphone. And I think that was the right move. There are certainly compromises. The dual camera setup is difficult to justify at this price. Sustained performance isn't quite as strong as what you get from the larger Fold 8 Ultra. And if you are a heavy user, the battery may only just get you through a full day. But those drawbacks don't erase what Samsung has achieved with the overall design. After spending a week with the Galaxy Z Fold 8, I genuinely have a different idea of what a book-style foldable should feel like. You still get the huge internal display whenever you need it, but the wider and shorter proportions make the phone feel much more normal when it's closed. It's easier to hold, it's easier to use one-handed. The outer screen is finally good enough that you don't constantly feel like you need to unfold the phone, and that combination makes the Fold 8 surprisingly addictive. So if your priority is maximum performance, multitasking and productivity, the Galaxy Z Fold 8 Ultra is still the obvious choice. But if you want a Samsung foldable that is more practical, more comfortable, easier to live with, and frankly more fun to use every single day, the regular Galaxy Z Fold 8 is the one I would pick.